Hey everybody, this is chapter 3 of Bolshevism, Its Roots, Role, Class View, and Methods by Rudolf Sprenger, which is the pen name of Helmut Wagner. Chapter 3 is titled The Political Line of Descent. The first bourgeois revolutionary movement in Russia was that of the Decembrists, whose radical wing was exterminated by the Romanovs. The Decembrists wanted to win a democratic constitution for Russia. This was also the goal of the revolutionary trend that arose in the following decades. For example, the student circle to which Chernyshevsky belonged. Quote, "To young Russia," end quote. The manifesto issued by Chernyshevsky's group called for a, quote, "bloody and pitiless revolution," end quote, to do away with, quote, "all the bases of contemporary society and all the supporters of the existing social order," end quote. It contained a number of democratic demands and culminated with the expression of its belief in the, quote, "social and democratic republic," end quote. While Bukharin's revolutionary program stood for the destruction of Tsarism and the suppression of all, quote, "exploiters," end quote, the landed nobility and the merchant and industrial capitalist classes, the Narodniki terrorists set for themselves a more definitely bourgeois task. After the fall of Tsarism, they were going to convoke a constituent assembly. The 1880 program of the Narodnaya Volya included demands for a representative assembly, provincial and municipal autonomy, freedom of religion, speech, press, and assembly, universal franchise, a territorial militia, the nationalization of the soil, and sanctions providing for the transfer of the ownership of factories to workers. All this was going to be applied by the provisional revolutionary government that would arise upon the fall of the autocracy. The provisional revolutionary government was going to assure the completion of the countrywide transformation and guarantee the democratic elections to the Constituent Assembly. In other words, the program of the Narodniki already contained much of the Jacobin idea of a transitional dictatorship. The aim of the Russian Revolution had been recognized and discussed for some time before the appearance of a social democratic movement in Russia. The social democracy had merely taken it over and called it its own. The program of 1903 recognized that the first task of the party's revolutionary activity, quote, "the defeat of Tsarism and the establishment of a democratic republic," end quote. 1 year before, Lenin took the trouble to explain that the Russian Social Democrats could not throw overboard the whole of populism, but, quote, had to lay hold of populism's revolutionary general democratic principles and recognize them as their own, end quote. Lenin. The Bolsheviki continued the line of the preceding bourgeois revolutionary movement, not only organizationally but also politically. While Zinoviev designated the Decembrists as, quote, revolutionists who were without question bourgeois, end quote, Zinoviev added emphatically, quote, "our generation does not spurn even this heritage," end quote, and went on to say that, quote, "we," parenthesis, the Bolsheviki, end parenthesis, "are the sole and true continuators of all that was excellent in the movement of the revolutionary intellectuals of the 80s, 70s, 60s, and even before then," end quote. Zinoviev, on the development of our party, parenthesis, on the development of our party, end parenthesis. Also, Pokrovsky found it important to stress the traditional tie-up between the old revolutionary movement and the Bolsheviki. He thus designates Spechnev, an outstanding member of a revolutionary circle in the 40s, as a communist because Spechnev, quote, "propagated the idea of the armed insurrection," end quote. Tkachev is for him, quote, "the first Russian Marxist," end quote, because the latter stood at the head of a movement, quote, "which called for the formation of a strong conspiratorial organization for the purpose of seizing power, though by means of old petty bourgeois blankist forms," unquote. And the first terrorist attentat by the Narodniki is recognized by Pokrovsky as, quote, "the first social revolutionary heroic act, the first gesture of the Russian Revolution," end quote. Just as the proclamation, quote, "to the young to young Russia," end quote, is, quote, "the first monument of our revolutionary socialism," end quote. The Narodnik terrorist was for Lenin's disciple a sort of Bolshevik. He resorted to terror because he could not as yet find support in the labor movement. Writing about the great leader of the terrorists, Zinoviev observed, quote, if he had bound himself to the working class and taken up the question of the social revolution, Sheliabov could have been considered a real Bolshevik and communist. End quote. The Russian social democracy was going to carry forward the movement that was begun by the old revolutionary intelligentsia. The Narodniki posed the task. The Social Democrats made it its own. The principal content of the activity of the Bolsheviki up to 1917 was the deepening and concretization of this task. New section. The tradition of national revolutionarism. The tradition of national revolutionarism. The aim of every bourgeois revolution is the creation of a modern nation-state in the framework of which may be realized the rule of the bourgeoisie. This was first accomplished with the aid of the radical democratic movement. Everywhere during the period of preparation for the bourgeois revolution, the ideas of nation and nationalism became a part of the revolutionary ideology. The old Russian revolutionists were also nationalists. They considered their socialism to be a particular Russian socialism, which would emerge from the Mir. The struggle against autocracy was for the Narodniki not only a struggle for the liberation of the people, but also a struggle for the liberation of, quote, Mother Russia, end quote. Herzen denied that Tsarism was a Russian phenomenon. Herzen said Tsarism was, quote, Prussian Tartar. Herzen said Tsarism was, quote, Prussian Tartar, end quote, a foreign body within the desecrated Russian nation. In contrast to the National Socialism of the Narodniki, the Russian Social Democracy began the Russian Social Democracy's activity with the avowal of internationalism. The truth of the matter, however, is that the element of revolutionary nationalism now expressed in Stalinism already existed in the old Bolshevism. In the midst of the struggle against the social chauvinism of the Western social democracy, Lenin wrote under the title, The National Pride of the Great Russians, quote, Is then the sentiment of national pride alien to us great Russian class-conscious proletarians? Of course not. We love our language and our fatherland and strive to raise its toil masses to a conscious democratic and socialistic life. We suffer seeing our beautiful native land subjected to acts of violence and oppression, to a grievous yoke by the czarist officials, by the landowners and the capitalists. We are proud to witness that these acts of violence have evoked opposition in our midst in the camp of the great Russians. We are proud that out of this camp have come forward Radishchev, the Decembrists, and Raznachinsky, revolutionists of the 70s. We are proud that in the year 1905, the great Russian working class created a powerful revolutionary mass party, and that the great Russian Yusik is becoming democratic and is beginning to chase out the priests and the landowners. End quote. Lenin. And Lenin continues with the utmost patriotic self-esteem, quote, We, the great Russian workers, full of the sentiment of national pride, desire at any price a free, independent, self-reliant, democratic, republican, proud, great Russia, ... end quote. Lenin. Lenin puts this national pride side by side with socialism, expressing very clearly the outlook of the nationalism of the Narodniki. Quote, the interest of the, quote, the interest of the, parenthesis, not slavishly constituted, end parenthesis, national pride of the great Russian fits in with the socialist interests of the great Russian, parenthesis, and all other, end parenthesis, proletarians, end quote. Lenin. These remarks bring to the surface the emotional current that offered motive power to the Bolshevist intelligentsia. The task they recognized as theirs was that of freeing the nation from the yoke of autocracy. In other words, they continued, with the aid of superior social discernment and more effective political methods, the work that was begun by the Narodniki, who were hampered in their time by their peculiar illusions and inadequate political methods. Together with this bourgeois revolutionary task, Bolshevism took over certain elements of the national revolutionary ideology of the populace. This ideology was quiescent during certain periods of the struggle, but came to the fore when the Bolsheviks had won political power. In Stalin's phrase, quote, socialism in one country, end quote, we have Lenin's, quote, national pride of the great Russians, end quote. and the final realization of the Narodnik concept of a special kind of Russian, quote, socialism, end quote. New section. Bolshevism and Jacobinism. Lenin not only required the connection between the Bolsheviki and the earlier revolutionary movements of his country, Lenin also sought to tie up the position of his party with the general tradition of classic bourgeois revolutionarism. When the Mensheviks, after the 1903 Congress of the Russian Social Democracy, reproached Lenin for resorting to Jacobin methods, Lenin immediately picked up the epithet and declared, quote, "The Jacobin, inseparably bound to the proletarian organization of the proletariat, aware of the proletariat's class interest, that precisely is the revolutionary social democrat," end quote. Lenin. Lenin branded the Mensheviks as the, quote, Gironde, end quote, the, quote, vacillating petty bourgeois wing, end quote, of the Russian Revolution. This comparison was borrowed from Plekhanov, who attacked, quote, reformism and, quote, economism in the Iskra of 1900, wrote, quote, "Two different trends are already apparent in the general socialist movement, and the revolutionary struggle of the 20th century is possibly moving toward a split which can be described as the separation of the social democratic, quote, mountain from the social democratic, quote, Gironde," end quote. Plekhanov. In 1905, Lenin called Engels a, quote, true Jacobin of the social democracy, end quote. Lenin reverted again and again to this comparison with Jacobinism. The term was later applied by Lenin's disciples to Lenin himself. Thus, Zinoviev called Lenin a, quote, Marat, which is in reference to Jean-Paul Marat, a famous painting of him called The Death of Marat by David. I'm not sure who painted it, so ignore that. A, quote, Marat, joined to the urban and agrarian proletariat, end quote. Zinoviev. Bolshevism has been likened to Blanchism, but Engels has well explained what ought to be understood as Blanchism, quote, that a relatively small number of resolute, well-organized men would be able, at a given favorable moment, not only to seize the helm of the state, but also to keep power by energetic and unrelenting action, until that small number of resolute, well-organized men had succeeded in drawing the mass of the people into the revolution by marshalling the mass of the people around the small band of leaders, end quote. Engels, Introduction to Civil War in France. Judged in this sense, the Bolsheviks were not Blanquists. They, as a well-organized minority, did not plan to seize power by means of a putschist attack, say as the Narodniki hoped to arrive at power by means of their terrorist attentats. The Bolsheviks aimed rather to organize and lead the revolutionary mass process. Historically, the role of the Bolsheviki is most like that of the Jacobins. Both movements expected to attain their dictatorial power in the course of the process, solving the task of a radical bourgeois revolution. But Bolshevism is also akin to Jacobinism because of the similar organizational methods and techniques of procedure used by the two chronologically separate movements. Both the Jacobins and the Bolsheviks represented, quote, leader, end quote, parenthesis, vanguard, end parenthesis, organizations of professional revolutionaries, themselves directed from, quote, top to bottom, end quote. Both movements stressed the belief in omnipotence of their organizations in determining, with an iron hand, the course of the revolutionary process. Both pursued their aims with inflexible determination and sought to attain their goal by all means at hand. And finally, the two movements found themselves in a similar relation to the bourgeoisie of their countries. Quote, the Jacobins made the bourgeois revolution without the bourgeoisie, end quote. Parenthesis, Trotsky, The Nature of the Russian Revolution, page 43, end parenthesis. And so did the Bolsheviks. In all these ways, Bolshevism was true Jacobinism. The social content of the Russian Revolution differed from the French Revolution of 1789 to 93 in the same manner that the Russia lorded over by Tsarist absolutism, with its developed industrial capitalism, differed from the absolutist society of 18th century France, disturbed by the then awakening capitalist production. but the general line of relation between Bolshevism and Jacobinism is that of the bourgeois revolution, which destroyed absolutism and could be advanced only by the most radical means at hand. Avowing Jacobinism, Lenin extended the Bolshevist tradition to the French Revolution, and thus provided the Russian revolutionary intelligentsia with an international, quote, class-conscious, end quote, tradition. Summary. New section. The Russian social democracy sprang from the intelligentsia, embodying the bourgeois revolutionary movement of Russia. It took an important step forward when it discovered the possibility of a mass basis for its politics in the Russian proletariat. The Russian social democracy then assumed toward the Russian workers the same role that the Narodnik General Staff before had taken towards the peasants. Inheriting the Narodnik tradition, the Bolsheviki, a fraction of the Russian revolutionary intelligentsia, took over the political task of the bourgeois revolution in their country. This national tradition and these national tasks are given recognition by their leader Lenin in his acknowledgement of the, quote, interest of the national pride of the great Russians, end quote. The Bolsheviks also sought to attach themselves to the international tradition of the revolutionary intelligentsia. They designated themselves as the Jacobins of the social democracy and resorted to political methods typical of Jacobinism. From the beginning, the Bolsheviks considered themselves to be the shock troops of the Russian Revolution. Bolshevism adapted itself to the special conditions of the Russian Revolution and created a great revolutionary ideology and tradition which helped the party to face its historic tasks. Again, that was Chapter 3 of Rudolf Sprenger, also known as Helmut Wagner. The chapter was titled The Political Line of Descent. Thank you so much for listening.